just want him to hear you, though. You claim now. It's not necessary. Okay. So what we need. Hello, hello. Yeah. So now, hearing her.
Hey man, can you hear me okay? Actually, I think I might have my system preference.
Hello.
Oh yeah, I got you. Good.
Yeah, it's working, but it's not gonna. It doesn't look like it's. If there's this. Hello. Or. Hello.
Hey, I can hear you all right. Do I sound okay?
So it should be.
It looks like. I like that. JW on the air.
Yeah. You guys can hear me okay?
Okay, give us just a second. We're working on our sound over. Can you give me a couple tests?
Yeah. Test. This is JW coming from the inside of a mountain. Test. The bunker audio feed.
Oh, give us just a second here, JW, and then we'll have you on. Give us just a second here.
Okay, I thought you still needed more lorem ipsum. I'll be quiet now.
Oh, what I do? Hang on. Is it back on? Okay.
All right, guys.
So, Paul, do solid. At like 7:25, you go downstairs and check the door. Godfather. All right. What's that? Should we change the numbers? Change it right now. All right, guys, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? All right. So, wait, you're going to check it?
Two.
Oh, why would it say? All right, we're almost there, JW. Hang on. So for any of you that are new here, I'm Ronnie B. I'm one of the co-founders of the Idaho Bitcoin Group. What we're trying to do is just educate, entertain, onboard everybody, get everybody in safely. What's that? We try and convert all the gold miners and stackers in cryptocurrency digital monies, right? And we might even have one of the coin shop guys show up a little bit. He's on his way back. Oh, see if he makes in. So guys, 2 speakers tonight. We actually have a powerhouse. We've got JW Weatherman. He runs a couple different online platforms. He's an online influencer. He's got 20 years experience down in Silicon Valley with startups. And he's going to talk to us tonight about the threats, both present, future, against Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies. JW, are you on board?
Yeah. You guys can hear me all right?
Okay, yeah. So JW, it looks like I can't remember where's Chewbacca from, you guys? I can't remember. Hey, anyway, we love the Star Wars. You've got the floor. Go ahead. You can reintroduce yourself since I kind of butchered it if you'd like to, and then dive right into it. And then we're going to do some Q&A for you.
Yeah, awesome. So let's see, we're doing it, if I remember right, about 20 minutes, 20-minute lecture, 20-minute Q&A. Is that still the plan? Awesome. Okay. All right. So thank you guys for having me. I have been in the startup world, software world for about 20 years, focused on software security. One of the projects that working on more than anything else right now is mathbot.com. And the basic idea of that project is to teach kids math and programming for free online, and also use Bitcoin. So parents can, pay $50 for algebra, and then we'll give the kids $45 in Bitcoin as they pass levels and master topics. So that's kind of my day job, if you could call it that. I'm more retired than not when that's your day job, I think. But I've also been in software security, really focused on that for a long time. So what I want to talk to you guys about tonight is the Bitcoin threat model. This is a document I put together about a year ago. And a threat model is a systematic analysis of all of the bad things that can happen to something and all of the things that should be there to prevent it. So you can threat model anything. A lot of the early threat models were done for like nuclear silos or nuclear installations or biohazard sort of research places. And anytime that something matters enough, it's a good idea just to list out all of the things that could happen. And you want to do it in a very systematic and structured way. What I want to do for a little while here is I'm going to just share the Bitcoin threat model. You can get to that from, if you have a laptop, you can go to btcthreats.com and follow along, but I'll also show this up on the screen. And so I'm going to walk through kind of the document, give you guys an overview of it. It might start out a little bit dry, but there's a lot of really juicy stuff in here because we've had Bitcoin get attacked by a bunch of different groups. And, you never know who is behind a given attack, or you rarely do. We know in some cases, in other cases we don't, but it's really interesting to see how, just up until recently, people thought about trying to break Bitcoin and poured money into it. One of the things you have to do when you're trying to figure out all the ways to destroy something, though, is really define what it is. And open source software is kind of tricky for that. If you're doing it for, Microsoft Office, then you're basically looking at all the ways that bad guys could hurt shareholders, right? They could do anything to like defame the brand or interrupt customers from being able to get access. But with open source software, there's no customers really, and there's no shareholders. There's really no owners, right? It's just code that people have written and they've given away for free. So the way that you kind of have to think about that as open source software is like a mission. So Bitcoin is a mission. It's a goal to create sound money, to create money that governments can't mess with. They can't inflate. The main way that we get taxed at this point is not through income tax or property tax. It's because the Federal Reserve prints money and gives it to their buddies, and that makes the dollars that we save less valuable. So Bitcoin is an attempt to create a money that can't be stolen through inflation, can't be manipulated in that way, and allows people to basically keep their stuff. So when you look at it that way, there's all kinds of interesting ways you can attack that, and that's what we're going to run through. So let me see if I can flip my screen share here. Okay, so just really quickly, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the table of contents, but the way that this is structured is there's basically two major categories of ways that you can destroy Bitcoin or prevent Bitcoin from being adopted as global money. The first are things that you can do on the software side. So you could do things to try to break the software. You could try to insert a security flaw into the software and get people to download and run that. Those things have been attempted many, many times, and it's interesting all the different ways that people have done that. But the other major way that you could do it is you can go after the humans that run the software, because Bitcoin is something that it's not just a piece of software, it's a network, and it's running all the time. A good analogy for it is that it's an artificial intelligence. It's very simple software, but if you think of it as like a separate organism that exists, and it pays people to feed it. It pays people to feed it electricity and to allow it to operate and run the way that it wants to. And then it has certain properties and certain utilities that users of Bitcoin appreciate. And so when they use it, they pay Bitcoin in the sense by wanting to own Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is able to pay the humans that operate the network to keep it alive and keep it growing and keep it stronger. So if you can go after those humans and you can stop them, if you could get your hands on every human that's running the Bitcoin software and kill them or punish them or prevent them from doing what they're doing to keep the network alive, that's the other major way that you could take down Bitcoin. And this document is an attempt to be a complete catalog of that. So if you are, if you're working for the Federal Reserve, this document should be helpful, because you can try all of these things. The good news about this about Bitcoin and this analysis is that the conclusion of it that I came to is I can't think of a way to break Bitcoin. So at the end of the day, it's up and it's running. You know, you don't need me to tell you that. There's $100 billion worth of money that you could steal if you could find a way to break it. You could short it and make a ton of money doing that. So there's a lot of people attempting to do it, and that's probably better evidence that nobody's found a way to break it. But this document is a pretty holistic, systematic analysis of all of those attempts, and I don't think that any of them will work. So that's the good news. But it's still very interesting to look at things that you could do. So one of the things that could happen with Bitcoin to prevent adoption is somebody could go around and they could try to steal all of the user's private keys. When you own Bitcoin, you have the ability to move it to somebody else. You don't actually it's not physical, right? It's digital, it's on a network. The private key is basically a really, really long password. And when you provide that password, when you use that password to sign a transaction, that transaction is valid and it will allow you to move that Bitcoin to somebody else. And it's just an update of balances. So if you were trying to attack Bitcoin, one of the ways that you could do that is you could go after people that own Bitcoin private keys. And we have had some good examples of that happening. The Mount Gox thing was arguably one of these situations where all of the private keys got stolen. People weren't owning their own private keys. They were keeping their Bitcoin on an exchange, and somebody logged in to that exchange. Maybe it was insider employees. Maybe it was somebody that hacked in. But there have been, that was a pretty bad situation. And it did actually really slow Bitcoin adoption. Many people thought that Bitcoin was hacked. If you talk to the average person today, they'll still say, oh, I think in 2014, Bitcoin was hacked and all this money was stolen. Not really, but it was still an effective attack because it slowed adoption of this secure money. So the way that we've addressed that since then is we've been very, very aggressive about encouraging people to own their own keys. So if your password is the only thing that gives you ownership to Bitcoin and you give that password to another company, we've really worked hard to ingrain the idea that that's not your Bitcoin. It's an IOU at that point. You don't own Bitcoin. You have now used a Bitcoin bank. And if that Bitcoin bank decides that they want to take the money and run, we're talking about relatively untraceable digital cash. Not the best idea to give to somebody else and trust them, especially if they're, some Silicon Valley startup that some joker started. So that's one of the things that we've done. We've also made a lot of progress in hardware wallets. So you guys have probably heard about Trezors and Ledgers and, these little USB devices. It makes it a lot easier for you to keep your private keys. And my favorite thing that we've done is we've come up with a way for every time you have a Bitcoin transaction, you want to have a new private key because it improves your privacy a lot. So what we've done is we've come up with a way to have a 24-word password, and then that password can be used to create thousands of private keys. But as long as you have that 24-word password, you can always recreate all of your private keys. So the user experience has improved a lot. The security has improved a lot. And there's still a lot of people that keep their money on Coinbase. So we're still going to have this attack occur again in the future. But at this point, there's enough exchanges to where it will be a blip on the road. It won't greatly slow adoption, I think. Here's another one that people are worried about. An attacker could use a quantum computer to guess everyone's private keys. So you have a 24-word password. That's pretty big. It's really, really big, actually. Like, it's so big that if you used all of the atoms in the universe to build the computer, you couldn't guess the number. So it's really, really big. But there is concern that, well, if we completely rewrite the laws of physics by building a quantum computer, then maybe we can do that. It turns out that actually quantum computers are not, they can only solve a certain set of problems, and this is not one of the problems that we think that they're going to be able to solve. That said, worst case scenario, if this did happen, and it would be It would be Star Trek sort of stuff. If this did happen, then we can swap out the algorithm. It wouldn't be pleasant, but we do have algorithms that are that even if this one fails, we can replace. And that's one of the things that's interesting about open source software. Like, I'm talking to you guys about the Bitcoin security model right now, but Bitcoin is constantly evolving. It doesn't really exist, in a vacuum. There's hundreds of developers working right now to improve its privacy, its security, its speed, and all those sort of things. And we're constantly evolving it. So that's why it's important to look at Bitcoin as more of a mission than a set of lines of code, because those are always in flux. You can't look at it even as a group of people, because open source projects are weird. There's hundreds of people that have worked on it, and there's people that have showed up and worked on it for a few hours and then gone away and never come back. So it's not really a group of people. It's not a team. It's not a set of code. It's a mission that is evolving over time. Let's see. I want to jump around a little bit because I'm already halfway through the lecture. So if you guys are getting bored, you only have 8 minutes left, and then we'll do Q&A. Let's see. So good deal. So an attacker could broadcast a large number of transactions that pay himself in order to clog the network. This is something that we actually saw about a year ago. There was actually a series of attacks that hit Bitcoin a year ago. And it resulted in a fork. You guys may or may not have heard of Bitcoin Cash. But leading up to the attempt to insert a security flaw into Bitcoin, which is another attack that happened after, what happened was really sophisticated, because instead of just showing up and saying, hey, we want to introduce a security flaw, these attackers first spent really hundreds of millions of dollars. At this point in time, we know that we more or less know that the attackers were a company called Bitmain. They're a very big Bitcoin company. They've produced a lot of Bitcoin miners. And if I remember correctly, they are $100 billion in the hole after accomplishing these attacks, which is roughly, say, 25 aircraft carriers. That's more aircraft carriers than a lot of countries have. I think France has like 2 aircraft carriers. Aircraft carriers somewhere around $5 billion. So $100 billion is some pretty good cheese. And they spent it on this attack over the last year and bankrupt themselves, basically. They're trying to do an IPO now, and they are in trouble. But one of the things that they did is they broadcast a lot of transactions. They're miners, and so they get a miner fee when you confirm a Bitcoin transaction. You get to when you confirm a block, a set of Bitcoin transactions, Bitcoin rewards you by giving you some free Bitcoin. And the guys that run those computers are miners, and Bitmain was a huge miner. So they were able to put a lot of transactions on the wire, right? Push a lot of transactions through Bitcoin. And if there were fees, they were able to get them back themselves. If somebody else was to try to do that, if you were to try to do this, then you would end up paying an incredible amount of fees, because you can only get a transaction into the network if you're willing to pay for it. And you pay through transaction fees, and that goes to the miner. So they had a little bit of an advantage, but at the end of the day, they spent a lot of money because they're not the only miners. So they were pushing a ton of transactions around. Basically, they weren't taking Bitcoin and sending them to somebody else to make a purchase. They were taking Bitcoin and just sending it back to themselves to clog up the network. And this created a narrative that they were able to use to say that Bitcoin's broken. Bitcoin's really broken. The network's totally clogged. We have to do something. It's an emergency, right? And you see this a lot in these sort of really shady operations, right? Like before we go to war, there's always a Lusitania, right? Before we go to war in Vietnam, there's always a Gulf of Tonkin. So we kind of had this happen here where it was, oh, the network's a disaster. We've got to do something. It's got to be urgently done. We got to drop everything. Yes, there's risks, but brother, we got to do it or we're all going to die, right? And that's how they did it. They clogged the network. I remember paying a fee, I think of, no, you know what? Actually, it was Anyway, there are reports of people, and there were people that were paying fees of maybe $10 on Bitcoin, and that's really, really, really bad. Right now, the fees to do that same transaction is about 3 cents, 2 cents. So it was really, really an effective attack in the sense that it created a lot of fear. And what they did at that point is they tried to. I'm going to scroll down here, see if I can find it. They also did something that that's brought up here. They would mine blocks, and they would not include any transactions. It's called mining an empty block. So we get a block every 10 minutes. It's a block of transactions, and the miner gets all of the fees, and they get a block reward, which is basically a subsidy for securing the network. That's going down every year, but eventually it will just be the mining fees. What these guys did is they decided they were going to mine a block and they were going to include no transactions. Now that's allowed on the network. There's nothing in the design of Bitcoin that prevents that from happening, but it's really, really expensive because you're just, there's thousands of dollars that you can have that's just sitting there for free. And you're saying, I don't want those thousands of dollars. I'm going to not include the transactions. It doesn't cost you anything to include the transactions. So they were doing that as well. And that was also clogging up the network because transactions weren't getting through. So you can slow Bitcoin's transactions. You can make it to where people can't execute payments, but it might cost you $1 billion, and that's just fine, right? That's eventually people will learn that it just doesn't make sense to attack Bitcoin because they just completely get destroyed financially. So that's the solution there. Yep, you can mine blocks if you want. If you want to leave all that money on the ground, you can. But over time, the economics say that you will eventually go broke while other miners are being more profitable. So the honest miners that are including transactions and basically serving the consumer, their business grows. You do dirty stuff, you want to spit in the hamburgers, you can, but you're going to go out of business. So that's the these things. Let's see. Did I lose you guys for a second there? Sorry. So one of the things that you could do with Bitcoin is you could try to get all of the people that run the Bitcoin software to run software that has a security flaw into it. So if a developer, for example, was able to make a change to something in the open source software, right? Anybody could get access to the code. It's freely available. They can do whatever they want with it, and they can upload it back as long as the developers, the community of developers accept it. So what they wanted to do is they wanted to increase the block size. The block size limit is important because if it gets too big, then there'll be a lot of latency on the network, and that will cause mining centralization. And it'll also cause the nodes that validate all the transactions to make sure everybody's playing nice and nobody's doing anything dirty. It can make those guys really expensive to run. So the average person wouldn't validate their own transactions. And what that means is that we end up with two problems. One is that if the miners all get centralized into one place, let's say they all ended up in one city, Shenzhen, China, then anybody that wanted to attack Bitcoin could just go to one city in Shenzhen, China, and get all of the people that are running the mining software and just put a gun in their face and say, do this, and it would be done. So that's one problem. We really want all the miners to be geographically decentralized and spread out in multiple legal jurisdictions. And we actually want them to be hard to find. We want them to be, off in a cave somewhere, uploading via satellite. We don't want these guys to all have, big signs out front saying, if you want to shut me down, here I am. So getting them all into one place would have been very bad. The other problem is that if you trust somebody to validate transactions, then whoever you're trusting is vulnerable. I wouldn't want you guys all to trust me to validate your transactions because you couldn't pay me enough to be in a situation where I could have that sort of target on my back. So it's important that everybody's able to cheaply and quickly and easily validate that the transactions are right. So the block limit does that. And the security flaw that these guys ultimately wanted to push with everything leading up to this was to make that block limit so high that it was dangerous, and could cause those security flaws to come about. That didn't work. So they made a copy of Bitcoin, they introduced those security flaws, and then they put on a really effective marketing campaign. But that's basically over now, and Bitcoin survived that too. So that's it for the stuff that I wanted to kind of cover. It was basically just a random smattering of threats and the way that they've been dealt with in Bitcoin. But take a look at the document. It's much more thorough and systematic. And if you guys have any feedback after you do that, please let me know.
Okay, JW. So we've got a couple questions. First off, thanks a bunch. That was a pretty intense talk right there. First question is, with security, I've heard that you should only use your Bitcoin address once. Can you elaborate or expound on that? Like, why would we only use it once? What's the benefit?
Yeah, sure. So Bitcoin is they say it's pseudonymous. It's not. I don't know. It's somewhere between anonymous and pseudonymous. When you create a Bitcoin transaction, so if Bob wants to send money to Sally opens up her phone and she hits the receive button. A randomly generated number is created. And when Bob sends money to Sally, the money actually is just an entry in the ledger to that new randomly generated number. It's called the Bitcoin address, but it's not tied in any way. It doesn't have any information about Alice or her home address or KYC information or anything like that. But on the other hand, it does allow people that are looking at that transaction to see some things. It allows them to see that there's a balance on that address. So if it's 1.5 Bitcoin, anybody can look at the Bitcoin blockchain and see that randomly generated number has 1.5 Bitcoin. Not a real big deal, but if you continue to use that same address, and so like Fred and Tom and Joe, they all send money to Alice as well, and now that address has 5.5 Bitcoin. You're starting to leak more and more information about who you are, in the sense that those guys know that they paid you, they know who you are, and they know that address now has that amount of Bitcoin. So that's not really great, right? You don't want everybody that pays you to know how much Bitcoin you have. And you also don't want everybody that's just watching to be able to sort of piece things together and figure out who you are and who you're doing business with over time. So the solution to that, one of the solutions to that, that's not enough, but it's a huge step in the right direction, is just to simply create a new random number every time you receive Bitcoin from somebody. Because it makes it much harder to figure out who you are and how much Bitcoin you own if you take that step. So all of the new wallets do that. They've been doing that for a while now. So it's not ideal security yet. We're working on it, but I still would argue that it's a whole lot better than, I think it's better than cash as it sits right now, and it's certainly better than credit cards and debit cards. And nobody's buying a new car with a stack of $100 bills these days. So practically speaking, I think it's much better.
Okay, so we have one question about. All right, a question about how about the underlying network infrastructure that supports Bitcoin, the internet, and vulnerabilities of that network to attacks like the BGP protocol, for example?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the threats in the threat model is if you could prevent nodes from talking to each other, then they wouldn't be able to. The information that one node is looking at could be out of date, essentially, because other nodes have information that's newer, that's more accurate. And we are pretty dependent on the internet for that. There are some pretty interesting things that are being worked on to improve that. What's interesting about Bitcoin is that when people complain about it, they're usually complaining about like the cutting edge of humanity, right? So right now, if you wanted to open a new bank, and let's say we were in a free banking world and you could just create a bank and serve customers and you didn't have to follow all kinds of arcane, ridiculous rules. One of the things that you would run into real quick is, how do I know that the person that's showing up here is actually the owner of this account? Driver's licenses cost about $75, right? Somebody said somebody at the teller doesn't have the ability to verify who you are with this piece of plastic and photo that, you know, every kid can get their hands on. So the answer that you would come to is that you would realize, okay, we have to do some sort of password thing. And if you have this password, then this account is yours. And you'd also end up saying something like, look, I have no way of knowing who you are other than your password. So if somebody else gets your password, they are the owner of the bank account as far as I'm concerned, because I have to make that your problem. Because if I make it my problem, there's no way I can run a profitable business. So you end up with the same sort of private key, public key scheme, because it's just the very best that humans have ever come up with in authenticating that somebody is who they say they are. With Bitcoin, we've pushed the limits quite a bit on making that, like I said, way more and more user friendly. So we're not just sort of dealing with the world as it is. We're making it better for everybody in all situations, because the technology is completely more effective now. So with Bitcoin, another example of that is that, yeah, we're dependent on the internet. So how do we make the internet more robust? How do we take the internet itself to another level so that we're even more secure? And the two ideas that seem, well, there's three ideas that are really exciting to me. One is mesh networking. There's a company called, I think it's 10X. If you hit me up, I can send you a link. They're building basically devices that you can throw in your backpack that will, and this is, you know, you've probably heard about this stuff for years, but it's not BS anymore. You can throw this device in your backpack. If you're within range of another device or a Wi-Fi network, you'll be connected to the internet, and it can hop between those devices. So if 50 people have these devices and they're out in the woods, they're all connected to each other. If one person is connected to the internet, then all 50 devices are connected to the internet. That idea is picking up more and more steam. If we can get rid of internet service providers to make the internet infrastructure itself peer-to-peer, that's going to improve security quite a bit. We're going to take, at that point, the government is going to have a much harder time doing censorship, you know, whether it's, you know, some corrupt regime in another country or the United States trying to do surveillance on everything that we say and do and put it in a big data center. Those tasks are going to get much harder if we just have a more secure internet. So that's one idea. Another thing that has come out just in the last year is satellite connections. So there's now a satellite that will broadcast Bitcoin transactions. You can just grab an old Dish Network satellite and a little bit of hardware. And if you're, you know, in China and they use the Great Firewall of China to completely shut it down, you just point that at the sky and you're able to get the Bitcoin transactions. So, and it, you know, it can be a satellite dish that looks like every other TV satellite dish. And there's a lot of those in China. So that's going to be really hard to stop.
Okay. JW, the mesh networks sound pretty awesome. We're about out of time. So I want to finish off with one question here, if you don't mind. And then afterwards, any links you provide to me via email, I'll distribute out to our group. But
Cool.
my final question is, if we could only have one Bitcoin spokesperson or emissary in the entire ethos, just one, who do you pick?
Dang, that's a good question. I guess, well, I mean, I wouldn't want this person to end up dead. So that's the only reason I'm hesitant. The whole point of Bitcoin is that, that we don't have any central points of failure, but I'm going to say two people that I think are really awesome that I can't.
Okay.
I can't get it to one, but Nick Szabo and Adam Back, they have been working on these problems for 30 years. And way before Bitcoin existed, those guys were working on this stuff. And
I'll give it to you, man. You picked two of the greatest guys in the space. So, but listen, J-Dub, we're out of time. I want to say thank you very much. Everybody, big round of applause, please. And we really appreciate you coming on board. Any links that you send out to me via email, I'll distribute to the whole group. And we look forward to having you come up here to Boise and visit us in person one of these days.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
All right, JW, we'll see you later.